The world was made of dust and violence. It rose in a choking plume from the hooves of the horses, a red cloud that tasted of iron and heat. The stagecoach rattled like a dry gourd, its wooden frame groaning under the strain, as it careened down the canyon pass outside Redemption Gulch. Inside, Elsie Mae Whitlock held her daughter Clara tight against her chest, the child's whimpers lost in the cacophony of splintering wood and the sharp crack of gunfire that echoed off the sandstone cliffs. Panic was a living thing in the cramped coach, a wild animal clawing at the throats of the passengers. A drummer from St. Louis was praying aloud his words, a frantic, breathless litany. Across from them, a portly land surveyor had his eyes screwed shut, his face the color of spoiled cream. But Elsie's gaze was fixed out the window, watching the masked riders who moved with the fluid, terrifying grace of predators. The coach lurched to a halt with a final bone-jarring shudder. The door was wrenched open, and the world outside was filled with harsh sunlight and the menacing silhouette of a man. "Ladies, gentlemen," a voice drawled smooth as poured molasses, but with an edge of tempered steel. "Your valuables, if you please. Let's make this swift and painless." The leader of the bandits swung himself into the coach. He was not a hulking brute, but lean and coiled, with eyes that glittered with cold amusement above the bandana covering his face. He moved with an unnerving charisma, his presence filling the small space until it felt hard to breathe. He was Silas Blackwood. One by one, he relieved the passengers of their watches, wallets, and rings. The drummer handed over a thick roll of bills with a trembling hand. The surveyor fumbled with his gold watch chain. When Silas reached Elsie, she flinched instinctively, shielding Clara. His eyes lingered on her for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, before they settled on the thin silver chain around her neck. "Well now," he murmured, his voice a low purr. "What have we here?" Before she could react, his gloved fingers closed around the silver locket dangling from the chain. He yanked. The chain bit into her skin and snapped, leaving a raw red line. "No." The word was torn from her, a raw, desperate cry. "Please, not that. It's all I have of him." Silas held the locket in his palm, his thumb tracing the engraved initials WW. He flicked it open. Inside, nestled against worn velvet, was a tiny faded photograph of a handsome, smiling man. Her late husband, William. A strange, tight smile played on Silas's lips, hidden beneath the bandana. "A keepsake," he said, his tone mocking. He snapped the locket shut, the sound like a coffin lid closing. "Sentiment is a luxury, madam, and you, it would seem, can afford none." "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his cruel form. "It has no value to you. It's just a picture." He pocketed the locket and leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was for her alone. "Everything has value, Mrs. Whitlock. You simply have to know where to look." He then turned, stepping out of the coach as easily as he had entered. With a final, chillingly polite nod, he and his men spurred their horses and vanished back into the haze of red dust, leaving behind a wake of terror and a silence that was somehow more deafening than the gunfire. Elsie sat frozen, her hand clutching the empty space on her chest where the locket had been. The warmth of it was gone, replaced by a cold, hollow ache that had nothing to do with the robbery and everything to do with the final, brutal severing of her past. She was no longer just a widow. She was a ghost stripped of her last tangible memory, adrift in a land that promised no mercy. Redemption Gulch was a town gasping for breath. It lay baked and brittle under a relentless sun, a single dusty street flanked by false front buildings whose paint had been scoured away by wind and time. The saloon doors swung on weary hinges, spilling the scent of stale beer and desperation into the shimmering heat. Elsie walked the length of the main street, Clara asleep in her arms, feeling the weight of 100 scrutinizing eyes. She was a stranger, a woman alone, and in a town like this that made her a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. Her last few dollars saved for a room and a hot meal had been taken in the robbery. She was destitute with nothing to offer, but the strength in her hands and a fierce quiet pride that was rapidly crumbling. She tried the hotel first, then the boarding house, and finally the mercantile, asking for work for credit for anything. The answer was always the same: a suspicious narrowing of the eyes, a tight shake of the head. Her final stop was the sheriff's office. A sign bearing the name Sheriff Cole Hardy hung crookedly above the door. Inside, a man sat behind a cluttered desk, his face a roadmap of weary competence. He had a thick graying mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He listened to her story of the robbery with a patient, practiced air, nodding in all the right places. Silas Blackwood and his gang sounds like he said, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. Been plaguing this territory for months. They're ghosts, ma'am. Hit fast and disappear into the canyons. He took my locket, Elsie said, her voice small but firm. It had a picture of my husband inside. It's all I have left. Sheriff Hardy sighed a long, tired sound. He looked at her with a flicker of genuine pity, but it was the pity of a man with a long list of unsolvable problems. Ma'am, I understand. But a locket? In the grand scheme of things, with a federal lockbox missing from that same coach, it's not high on my list of priorities. I'm sorry for your loss, truly. But there's not much I can do. I'm not asking you to form a posse for a piece of jewelry, Sheriff Elsie replied, a spark of her old fire returning. I'm looking for a place to stay. Work. My daughter and I have nothing. He rubbed a hand over his tired face. The town's particular, Mrs. Whitlock. Folks are wary of outsiders, especially now with Blackwood's men sniffing around. There's no work to be had that I know of. He gestured vaguely toward the door. The church might offer you a meal, but they've got no room. I'm sorry. The apology, however sincere, was just another closed door. As Elsie stepped back out into the oppressive sunlight, the whispers began to follow her. They slithered from the porch of the mercantile, where a group of women were gathered, their faces pinched with suspicion. The leader, a woman with a face as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of glass, was Martha Briggs, the shopkeeper's wife. Another stray Martha's voice cut through the air, loud enough to carry. Probably followed some man out here and got herself abandoned. Or worse, the other women tittered, their gazes like stones. Elsie felt her cheeks burn with a hot, furious shame. She clutched Clara tighter, lowered her head, and walked on, but there was nowhere to go. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky, a biting wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the first premonition of a storm. The town of Redemption Gulch had offered her none. Every door was shut, every face turned away. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She couldn't stay here a target for scorn and suspicion, but the wilderness was no kinder. Looking up at the jagged peaks that loomed over the town, she saw the dark clouds gathering, churning like a pot of boiling ink. She had a choice: face the slow death of the town's contempt, or risk the swift mercy of the mountains. With a final despairing look at the unwelcoming lights of the town, she chose the mountains. She turned away from the dusty street and began the long, arduous climb into the foothills, praying for a hunter's shack, a cave, any shelter from the coming storm and the cruelty of men. The storm broke with the fury of a betrayed god. Rain turned to sleet, then to a blinding curtain of snow, driven by a wind that howled like a hungry wolf. The temperature plummeted. Elsie's thin shawl was useless, quickly soaked and frozen stiff. She stumbled through the darkness, her feet numb, her body shaking with a violent, uncontrollable chill. Clara, bundled inside her mother's coat, began to cry, a thin, weak sound that was nearly snatched away by the wind. This is how it ends. Elsie thought, a strange calm settling over her panic. Lost in a storm, just another nameless soul swallowed by the unforgiving land. Her knees buckled. She was about to surrender, to sink into the snow and let the cold take them, when she saw it through the swirling white. A faint flickering light. A ghost of a light, promising warmth, promising life. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through her. She staggered toward it, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. It was a cabin, small and solid, nestled in a grove of pines. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a fragile banner of defiance against the storm. With the last of her strength, she collapsed against the heavy wooden door, her knuckles rapping weakly against the timber. It was barely a sound, a mouse scratching for entry, but all her hope, all her world was contained in that faint plea. "Please," she whispered, her words freezing on her lips. "Help us, my child." The door creaked open. A monolith of a man filled the frame, a lantern held aloft in one hand. The light cast deep shadows across a face that seemed carved from the mountain itself, all hard angles and grim endurance. He was broad-shouldered, his frame hewn by years of solitude and hard labor. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were devoid of expression as they took in the pathetic sight of her, a half-frozen woman, kneeling in the snow, clutching a shivering child. He was Jonah Creed, a man who had come to the mountains to escape a world that had taken everything from him, a man who had found more comfort in the silence of the pines than in the company of his own kind. Visitors did not come here, especially not in a blizzard. Trouble followed people like her. He said nothing. His silence was vast and absolute, a wall of stone. In that stretching, terrible pause, Elsie's heart shattered. This was it, the final rejection. But then Jonah Creed stepped aside. Without a word, without a change in his stoic expression, he held the door open for her. The warmth that enveloped her was a physical shock so profound it made her dizzy. She stumbled inside, clutching Clara, as the door shut behind her, sealing out the storm's fury. The single room smelled of pine wood smoke and beans simmering over the hearth. It was sparse but clean, the domain of a man who lived with deliberate simplicity. Jonah moved to the fire, ladled a thick stew of beans and salted meat into a tin bowl, and set it on the small wooden table. He gestured to the single chair. His silence was unnerving, but there was no malice in it, only a deep, ingrained stillness. She sat balancing Clara on her lap. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the spoon. She fed her daughter first small, careful spoonfuls that the baby swallowed eagerly. Only when Clara's cries had subsided into contented murmurs did Elsie allow herself to eat. The hot food was an agony of pleasure in her empty stomach. Tears she hadn't known were left, slipped down her cheeks and dripped into the bowl. "Thank you," she whispered to the man's broad back. He gave no reply, only took up a block of wood and his whittling knife, seating himself by the hearth. The soft, rhythmic scrape of the blade against the pine was the only sound, besides the crackling fire and the howling wind. It was a strangely comforting sound, more soothing than any empty platitude could ever be. As the night wore on, Elsie rocked Clara to sleep, her own exhaustion a leaden weight in her limbs. She was safe. She was warm. But shame was a bitter bile in her throat. She had been reduced to a beggar, dependent on the mercy of a silent stranger. She wept quietly, careful not to disturb the peace of the cabin. From his place by the fire, Jonah did not look at her, did not move, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent, unobtrusive presence. He simply sat, his gaze fixed on the flames, a man wrestling with his own ghosts in the dark. The morning brought a world buried in white silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine, untouched blanket of snow that glittered in the pale sun. Elsie awoke from a deep, dreamless sleep on a cot by the fire to a startling discovery. Placed neatly beside her worn-out boots was a single repaired shoe. The split sole had been expertly stitched with thick leather cord, the workmanship strong and sure. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't asked. He had simply seen the need and met it. When she turned, Jonah was by the stove, pouring hot water into a cup. He set it on the table for her, his movements economical and deliberate. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting moment. In his gray gaze she saw not coldness, but a profound and guarded quiet. His silence was not a void. It was a language of its own, spoken in deeds, not words. Days bled into a week. Elsie, knowing she couldn't impose forever yet, having nowhere else to go, threw herself into earning her keep. She swept the rough-hewn floorboards, cooked their simple meals, and mended Jonah's worn shirts with neat, careful stitches. She brought an order and a softness to the Spartan cabin, and slowly a fragile domestic rhythm established itself between them. Clara, thriving in the warmth and safety, took her first wobbly steps across the floor, her delighted gurgles echoing in a space long accustomed to silence. The sound seemed to startle Jonah, and for the first time, Elsie saw the ghost of a smile touch the corner of his mouth. But necessity eventually drove her back to Redemption Gulch for supplies. As she walked into the mercantile, Clara on her hip, the atmosphere curdled. Martha Briggs stood behind the counter, her arms crossed her lips, a thin line of disdain. "Well, look what the storm blew in," Martha announced to the room. "Seems the mountain man found himself a pet. A widow living under Jonah Creed's roof. We all know what that means." The snickers of the other women were sharp as broken glass. Elsie's face flushed a painful crimson. She bought a small bag of flour with the last of her emergency coin, her hands trembling, and fled the sting of their judgment, following her all the way back up the mountain trail. The snow-covered path seemed longer and colder than before. That night, the weight of her shame was unbearable. After putting Clara to sleep, she stood by the cabin door looking out at the cold, indifferent stars. "I have to leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't bring this down on you. They'll ruin your name. They already think the worst of me." Jonah, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, grew still. He walked to a wooden chest in the corner, and pulled out a thick, hand-knitted wool shawl the color of a summer twilight. He draped it gently over her shoulders. It was new and warm, and smelled faintly of cedar. His silence was not indifference. It was defiance. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, but for the unwavering steadiness in his eyes. "Let them talk," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, unused to forming words. It was the first full sentence he had ever spoken to her. "The child needs a roof. You stay." His simple declaration was more profound than any grand promise. He was offering her not just shelter, but sanctuary. He was standing between her and the world's cruelty. Elsie pulled the shawl tighter around herself, the warmth of it seeping into her bones, chasing away a chill that had been there for years. In the quiet solitude of the mountains, under the roof of a silent, solitary man, she had found the one thing she thought she had lost forever, a place to belong. Spring came to the high country, not as a gentle awakening, but as a reluctant surrender. The snow receded in patches, revealing the damp, dark earth beneath, and the streams swelled with the melt of their roar, filling the valley. In the small cabin, a different kind of thawing was taking place. The quiet rhythm they had found deepened into a bond of unspoken trust and mutual respect. Jonah would leave a freshly caught fish on the porch. Elsie would leave a hot plate of food on the table when he returned from his trap lines. He carved a small, perfect wooden horse for Clara, leaving it by her cot one morning for her to discover. Elsie watched him from a distance as her daughter squealed with delight, and saw in his guarded face a tenderness he would never admit to. Meanwhile, in Redemption Gulch, the whispers about the widow and the mountain man had not subsided. They festered, nurtured by the righteousness of Martha Briggs and the idle boredom of the town. But another more dangerous current was also stirring. Two of Silas Blackwood's men, a wiry, rat-faced man named Jed, and a hulking, slow-witted brute called Pike had become fixtures at the saloon. They weren't robbing anyone. They were listening, asking quiet questions about newcomers, about the stagecoach robbery, about a woman with a child. Sheriff Hardy watched them with a growing sense of unease. He was a man bound by the letter of the law, but he possessed a deep, weary wisdom about the nature of men. Blackwood wasn't just a common thief. His raids were too precise, too targeted. The missing federal lockbox was the official story, but Hardy suspected something more personal was at play. He began to quietly review old town records, starting with the name on the locket Elsie had described, W. William Whitlock. He found it in the county assessor's office, filed away under mining claims. A deed registered 2 years prior for a significant gold strike in the northern canyons. It was registered to one man, William Whitlock. But stapled to the back of the file was a handwritten unofficial partnership agreement, never legally filed, bearing 2 signatures, William Whitlock and Silas Blackwood. Hardy also pulled the report on William's death, a mine collapse ruled an accident. But the details as he reread them now felt thin. The only witness was a drifter who had left town the next day. Officially an accident, the report said, but some details never sat right. The pieces began to click into place. This wasn't about a random robbery. This was a vendetta. Up on the mountain, Elsie remained blissfully unaware. Her world had shrunk to the cabin, the stream, and the small patch of earth where she had started a garden. Her life was simple, but for the first time since William's death, it was peaceful. She began to see the man Jonah was beneath his silent exterior, a man of profound integrity, whose kindness was expressed in the solid, dependable work of his hands. And he, in turn, saw the resilience and fire in her, a strength that the world had tried and failed to extinguish. The threat re-entered her life on a sunny afternoon as she and Clara were walking the path back from the stream. Jed and Pike stepped out from behind a thicket of aspen blocking her way. Well, look what we have here. Jed sneered, his eyes roving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. A pretty little thing all alone in the woods. Elsie instinctively pulled Clara behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs. What do you want? We're looking for something. Pike grunted, his gaze as dull as river stones. Something our boss is very interested in. A little silver locket. I don't have it, Elsie said, her voice shaking but firm. Your boss took it from me. Jed's smile was predatory. He thinks you know more than you're letting on. He thinks you know what was really inside it. He took a step closer, reaching a grimy hand toward Clara. Maybe the little one could help you remember. Before his fingers could touch the child, a shadow fell over them. Jonah Creed stood on the path, materialized from the forest as silently as a wolf. He held a wood axe in one hand, its weight resting easy and natural in his grip. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence was a physical force, his eyes 2 chips of ice promising swift, terrible violence. Jed and Pike froze. They were hard men, but they recognized a different kind of hardness in Jonah, something primal and absolute. Jed slowly lowered his hand, his sneer dissolving into a nervous twitch. Just asking questions, he stammered. Jonah took one slow, deliberate step forward. Go, he said. The single word was not a request. It was a command backed by the unshakable certainty of the mountain itself. The 2 men scrambled backward, then turned and fled down the path like startled rabbits. Elsie sagged with relief, her knees weak. Jonah's gaze softened as he looked at her, then at the terrified child clinging to her skirt. He had been forced out of his isolation, his quiet world breached by the ugliness she had inadvertently brought to his door. That evening, the unspoken peace of the cabin was gone, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The outside world had found them. The very next day, Sheriff Hardy rode up the mountain trail. He found Elsie outside hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 pines. Mrs. Whitlock, he said, tipping his hat. He looked different now, his weariness replaced by a grim urgency. I need to speak with you. It's about your husband." And Silas Blackwood. He sat with her at the small table in the cabin, Jonah standing silently by the hearth listening. Hardy laid it all out, and the gold claim, the secret partnership, the suspicious nature of William's death. Blackwood wasn't after the lockbox on that stage. Hardy concluded, his voice low. He was after you. He believes there's a map hidden in that locket. A map to the mine he thinks your husband stole from him. The world tilted under Elsie's feet. Her entire understanding of her past, of the man she had loved and mourned, fractured. William, a secret gold magnate, a thief, it was impossible. And yet, it explained so much: his secrecy in the months before he died, his sudden bouts of paranoia. A map, she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her chest. There was no map. Just his picture. Blackwood doesn't believe that, Hardy said grimly. And he's not a man who gives up. He knows you're here now. He'll stop at nothing to get what he wants. You and your daughter are in terrible danger. The conflict was no longer about a stolen keepsake. It was about a fortune in gold, a hidden murder, and a ruthless man's obsession. Elsie was no longer just a victim of a robbery. She was the unwitting keeper of a secret that could get her killed, a secret tied to the memory of a husband she was realizing she may never have truly known. Silas Blackwood did not like being defied. The news that his men had been run off by a silent recluse sent a cold fury through him. He had underestimated the situation. He had assumed the woman was a broken, helpless creature. Now she had a protector, a complication. He decided a more direct approach was needed to flush her out, to remind her of her vulnerability. He didn't target Elsie directly. That was too crude. Instead, he chose to squeeze the town that had, however reluctantly, given her refuge. His men rode into Redemption Gulch at dusk, not with guns blazing, but with a quiet, suffocating menace. They set fire to the livery stable. It wasn't a large fire easily contained, but it was a message written in smoke and fear. The next day they diverted a portion of the creek that fed the town's water troughs, causing chaos for the ranchers. Panic began to curdle the town's suspicion of Elsie into outright hostility. She was the cause of this. Her presence had brought Blackwood's wrath down upon them. Martha Briggs led the chorus of condemnation. "She's a curse on this town," she shrieked in the Mercantile. "The sheriff should run her out before Blackwood burns us all to the ground." Sheriff Hardy found himself caught in the middle, trying to maintain order, while knowing the townspeople were in a way right. Elsie was the magnet drawing the danger. He rode up to the cabin again, his face etched with worry. "It's getting worse, Elsie," he said, foregoing her formal title. "Blackwood is trying to turn the town against you, to leave you with nowhere to hide. He wants you isolated. He wants you desperate." Desperation was a familiar country. But this time she was not alone. Jonah, who had listened from the doorway, stepped forward. "She is not isolated," he stated, his voice a low rumble. He looked at the sheriff, then at Elsie. "And she is not leaving." It was a declaration of war. Jonah began to prepare. He was no gunslinger, but he was a man of the mountains. He knew every trail, every cave, every hidden pass. He spent his days fortifying the cabin, teaching Elsie how to load and fire a rifle. His large, calloused hands, surprisingly gentle as they guided hers. His silence was replaced by clipped, practical instructions, his movements filled with a grim purpose. He was a man waking from a long slumber, roused by a threat to the small flicker of life he had allowed back into his world. Silas Blackwood, however, was a student of human weakness. He knew fear was a powerful tool, but love, or its protective instinct, was even stronger. He had been watching his scouts reporting on the mountain man's preparations, on the woman learning to shoot, on the small child playing by the cabin door, and he saw his opening. The attack came not at the cabin, but on the road. The sheriff had arranged for Elsie and Clara to be moved to a supposedly safe location, a remote ranch owned by a deputy's cousin, while he tried to gather a posse. It was a trap. One of Blackwood's men had been on the deputy's payroll for months. They were ambushed in a narrow canyon. The wagon driver was shot before he could even draw his pistol. Jed and Pike dragged Elsie and Clara from the back, but they didn't take them away. That wasn't the plan. They tied Elsie to a wagon wheel, forcing her to watch as Pike held a knife to Clara's throat. "No!" Elsie screamed, struggling against the ropes until her wrists were raw and bleeding. "Please don't hurt her. I'll tell you whatever you want." Silas Blackwood rode out from behind a rock formation. His handsome face unobscured his smile, a chilling slash of white. "I know you will," he said calmly, dismounting. He knelt in front of her, his eyes boring into hers. "The locket, Mrs. Whitlock. I know you think it was just a picture. But my dear, foolish William was a man of secrets and symbols. A map doesn't have to be on paper. It can be an inscription, a pattern on the frame, a mark on the photograph itself. Tell me what you remember. Every single detail." "I don't know anything." She sobbed, her eyes fixed on the gleam of the knife at her daughter's neck. "It was just a picture. Please let her go." A disappointing answer, Silas sighed. He nodded to Pike. The brute pressed the flat of the blade against Clara's soft skin, and the child began to wail in terror. It was the sound that broke the world. A shot rang out, not from the road, but from the cliffs above. Pike grunted, the knife clattering to the ground as he clutched a blossoming red stain on his shoulder. Another shot kicked up dust at Jed's feet, sending him scrambling for cover. Jonah Creed was moving along the ridge, a hunter in his element. He fired his rifle not with the speed of a gunslinger, but with the deadly patient accuracy of a man who knew one shot meant one meal or one life. He was drawing their fire, creating a diversion. In the chaos, Elsie saw her chance. With a surge of adrenaline, she twisted her hands, ignoring the searing pain, as the rough rope tore at her skin. The knot gave. She scrambled free, grabbing a heavy rock from the ground, just as Jed turned his pistol toward the cliffs. She brought the rock down on his head with all the force of her fear and rage. He collapsed in a heap. Silas stared, momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events. His carefully orchestrated trap had come undone. He looked from the bleeding Pike to the unconscious Jed, then up at the unhittable figure on the ridge, and finally at Elsie, who now stood between him and her daughter, her eyes blazing with a ferocity he had never imagined. He smiled, a slow, admiring smile. "Well played," he conceded. He backed away slowly toward his horse. "But this changes nothing. I know where you are now. There is nowhere left for you to run. I will have that mine." He swung into his saddle, grabbed the reins of Pike's horse, and galloped away, leaving his other man behind. As Jonah scrambled down the rocks to join her, Elsie knelt and pulled Clara into a desperate embrace, burying her face in the child's hair and breathing in her scent. The immediate danger was over, but Blackwood's final words echoed in the canyon. He wasn't just after the mine anymore. He had seen her strength, and now he wanted to break it. He had seen Jonah's devotion, and now he wanted to destroy it. It was no longer about gold. It had become a battle of wills, a fight to the death in the heart of the unforgiving mountains. The thunderstorm was a living beast, tearing at the sky with claws of lightning, and a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountains. Rain fell in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the world outside the abandoned Black Creek mine into a churning chaos of mud and shadows. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth, rotting timber, and cold metallic fear. The flickering light of a single lantern cast grotesque, dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. Silas Blackwood had chosen his battlefield well. He had sent a message via the captured Jed, now imprisoned in the town jail, a final meeting. Elsie and the locket's secret in exchange for Clara's permanent safety. It was a lie, they all knew it, but it was a summons that they could not ignore. Jonah, using his knowledge of the mountains, had led them here through a hidden entrance, hoping to turn Blackwood's trap back on him. Now they stood in the main chamber, a cavernous space supported by decaying wooden beams. Silas was there, along with 2 of his remaining men. He held the lantern aloft, his face a mask of calm, confident cruelty. "I am so glad you could make it," Silas said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "It seems fitting to end this where it all began. This very mine is where your husband William drew his last breath." Elsie flinched, pulling Clara tighter behind her. Jonah stood slightly in front of them, his rifle held at a low ready angle. His presence was a silent, solid shield. "He died in an accident," Elsie said, her voice trembling but defiant. Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. "An accident? My dear woman, there was nothing accidental about it. I was here. I watched the timbers give way. In fact, I encouraged them." He took a step forward, his eyes glittering in the lantern light. "He betrayed me. We found this strike together, swore an oath on it, and he filed the claim in his name alone, cutting me out. He was a thief, Elsie. He got precisely what he deserved." The confession hung in the air, as heavy and cold as the grave. The man she had mourned murdered. The grief she had carried a monument to a lie. But before the horror could fully settle, Silas smiled a malevolent, triumphant twist of his lips. But that he continued reaching into his coat pocket is not even the most interesting part of the story. You see, you have built your entire life, your entire sense of righteous grievance, on the memory of a good man wronged. You fight for his honor. But what if I told you he wasn't just a thief who betrayed his partner? What if I told you he was about to betray you too? He pulled out a small leather-bound journal and a folded, yellowed letter. He tossed them onto a dusty crate between them. His journal and his last letter. Not to you, my dear. To a woman in San Francisco. He was planning on cashing out, faking his own death in a more permanent way, and leaving you and the child with nothing. He never loved you. He loved the gold. You were just a convenience. Elsie stared at the letter, her husband's familiar, elegant script, visible even in the dim light. The world buckled the ground, falling away beneath her. Every memory, every shared smile, every whispered promise, all of it curdled into poison. She was fighting to protect the legacy of a man who would have discarded her like trash. The locket wasn't a symbol of love. It was a relic of a grand deception. The revelation was the true weapon. It was designed to shatter her resolve, to break her spirit. And for a moment it did. Her grip on reality faltered, the rifle she held feeling impossibly heavy. That was the moment Silas was waiting for. Now he hissed to his men, "Take the child." As his men lunged forward, the cavern was lit by a blinding flash of lightning from outside, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that vibrated through the rock. In that split second of brilliant light, Jonah moved. He fired not at the men, but at the lantern in Silas's hand. Glass shattered. The cavern was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Panic erupted. One of Blackwood's men fired his pistol blindly, the muzzle flash a brief, terrifying strobe that illuminated a scene of pure chaos. Jonah shoved Elsie and Clara toward a side tunnel. "Go now," he roared over the storm's fury. Another crash of thunder, closer this time, was accompanied by a deep, groaning sound from above. The mine, old and unstable, was reacting to the percussive blasts. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling. "He's getting away." Silas screamed in the dark. Another blind shot ricocheted off the rock wall inches from Elsie's head. Jonah returned fire. He was no longer just a protector. He was a force of nature as wild and untamed as the storm outside. He moved through the darkness with an assurance born of a lifetime in the wild, his senses sharp, his purpose absolute. He was fighting for the flicker of a future he hadn't dared to dream of. Elsie, huddled with Clara in the side tunnel, felt a shift inside her. The shock of William's betrayal was still a raw wound, but the immediate primal need to protect her daughter burned hotter. This was no longer about William's legacy. It was about Clara's future. It was about her own. A support beam, weakened by the blast, splintered with a sickening crack. A section of the ceiling collapsed, sealing the main entrance in a cascade of rock and earth. They were trapped. Silas, enraged and desperate, lit a match. In its fragile, sputtering light, he saw Jonah shielding Elsie. He raised his pistol for a final killing shot. But Elsie was ready. She lifted her own rifle, the one Jonah had taught her to use the stock firm against her shoulder. Their shots were almost simultaneous. The match went out. A heavy thud echoed in the sudden ringing silence. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing and the distant rumble of the storm. Jonah, Elsie whispered into the blackness, her voice raw. A groan answered her. Then his voice strained but steady. "I'm here." Another match flared, this one held in Jonah's hand. In its light, they saw Silas Blackwood slumped against the wall, a dark stain spreading across his chest. His 2 men were gone, likely fled or buried in the rockfall. The journal and the letter lay on the crate, a testament to a bitter and destructive truth. The immediate fight was over. Silas was defeated. But they were trapped deep inside a collapsing mine with the ghosts of 2 deceitful men, while the world outside tried to tear itself apart. The climax had passed, but the struggle for survival had only just begun. Dawn broke over a landscape washed clean by the storm. The air was cool and smelled of wet pine and damp earth. Inside the mine, the silence was absolute. After the fury of the climax, a profound aching exhaustion had settled over Elsie and Jonah. They had survived, but the darkness lingered both in the tomb-like blackness of the mine and in the heavy truths that had been unearthed. Jonah, despite a flesh wound in his arm, had been their anchor. With calm, methodical purpose, he had assessed their situation. The main entrance was hopelessly blocked, but he remembered an old air shaft, long abandoned, that might lead to the surface. For hours they worked by the light of their one remaining lantern, clearing rubble, testing the stability of the tunnels moving deeper into the mountain's belly. Elsie worked alongside him, her grief and rage channeled into the hard physical labor. She did not speak of William's letter. The betrayal was a cold, hard stone in her chest, too heavy for words. Clara, blessedly resilient, had fallen asleep bundled in Elsie's shawl. Her small, steady breaths were a constant reminder of what was at stake. They found the air shaft just as the lantern began to gutter and die. It was a narrow, vertical climb, choked with roots and loose rock, but at the top they could see a faint circle of gray light. Hope, fragile but fierce, returned. With Jonah pushing from below and Elsie climbing above, they made their slow, painstaking ascent toward the surface, toward life. They emerged into the pale morning light, blinking like creatures born from the earth, covered in dirt and grime, bruised and bleeding, but alive. The walk back to the cabin was a silent pilgrimage. The world felt alien too, bright too loud after the suffocating confines of the mine. Sheriff Hardy and a small posse found them on the trail. Jed, broken by a night in a cell, had confessed everything directing them to the mine. The sheriff's face when he saw them was a mask of profound relief. "We found Blackwood's other men," he told them quietly. "They were trying to ride out of the territory. They'll stand trial." He looked at the sealed entrance to the mine. As for Blackwood, I suppose the mountain delivered its own justice. He offered to escort them back to town, but Elsie shook her head. "We're going home," she said, and the word felt right for the first time. Back at the cabin, the stillness was a balm. While Jonah tended to his wound, Elsie washed the dirt from her daughter's face and hands, her movements gentle and deliberate. They were all changed. The ordeal in the mine had burned away all pretense, leaving only a raw, undeniable connection between them. They were no longer a broken woman and her silent savior. They were equal survivors who had faced the darkness together and chosen the light. Later that day, the town, now aware of the full story, began to show its contrition. The mercantile owner left a box of provisions on the porch. The doctor rode up to check on Jonah's arm, refusing any payment. Even Martha Briggs, when she saw Elsie from a distance, had the decency to look away, her face flushed with a shame that was long overdue. The whispers had finally died, replaced by a grudging, hard-won respect. Elsie sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jonah came to stand beside her, the silence between them no longer a void, but a shared space of understanding and peace. He held out his hand. In his palm lay William's journal and the letter which he had retrieved from the mine. She took them, her fingers tracing the leather cover of the journal. This was the final ghost to be laid to rest. The following morning, Elsie walked alone to the small windswept cemetery on the edge of town. She stood before the simple wooden cross that marked William Whitlock's grave. For a long time, she just stood there, the cool mountain air on her face, letting the memories, the good and the false, wash over her. She remembered the charming man she had fallen in love with, and now saw the selfish stranger he had truly been. He was neither a saint to be worshipped, nor a simple villain to be hated. He was a flawed, broken man, whose greed had nearly destroyed them all. She opened the journal and the letter. She did not read them. The truth Silas had hurled at her was enough. She had no need to immerse herself in the precise details of the betrayal. Instead, she knelt and with her bare hands dug a small hole in the earth at the foot of the grave. She placed the journal and the letter inside. Then from her pocket she took the silver locket. Sheriff Hardy had recovered it from Blackwood's body, its surface dented and tarnished, but intact. She looked at the handsome, smiling face of her husband one last time, acknowledging the complex, painful truth of the man he was. Then with a quiet finality, she snapped it shut and placed it in the hole on top of the other secrets. As she covered it all with dirt, she was not burying her past, but letting it go. She was releasing the ghost of the man she thought she knew, forgiving him not for his sake, but for her own, so that his shadow would no longer fall upon her future. A profound sense of peace settled over her, quiet and deep as the mountain bedrock. She turned and walked away from the grave, without a backward glance. Her steps were light. The path ahead led up the mountain, back to the cabin. As she rounded the final bend, she saw it waiting for her. The door was open, and golden light spilled out onto the porch, a warm and welcoming beacon. Inside, she could see the silhouette of Jonah holding Clara in his arms, pointing out a bird in the pine trees. Clara's happy, tinkling laughter drifted out to meet her. This was not the end she had envisioned all those months ago, a life restored to what it had been. This was something new, something stronger, something earned through fire and loss. It was not a grand romance born of thunderous declarations, but a quiet love built on the sturdy foundation of shared survival, steadfast kindness, and a silence that held them safe. She had arrived at this door a beggar, asking for a single night's shelter. Now she was returning to it, whole and free, walking toward a life she had chosen, toward a family she had found. This was her home.